Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our study of the year 1968. In previous lectures, we've talked about some of the background factors leading us to the year 1968 in the 1950s and 1960s. In the following two brief lectures, I'm going to take a little bit of time to review one of the most important factors in American society by the year 1968, the Civil Rights Movement. These lectures will give just a brief overview for those who don't have much background and understanding of the Civil Rights Movement already. They're certainly not intended to provide a thorough and comprehensive review of the many different activities of the Civil Rights Movement, but should give you enough background to understand the things we're going to talk about, particularly events early in 1968 itself. The civil rights struggle in American history goes back far beyond World War II, and certainly the events we're going to talk about in this class beginning in the 1950s. So for those who are interested in a more thorough overview, I certainly invite you to consider some of the other courses that I have on YouTube or many other sources that are available elsewhere. For now, I'm going to begin in the 1950s. We could certainly begin with the 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, which many scholars mark as the kind of formal beginning of the civil rights movement itself. But let me start with Rosa Parks. And in part, I want to begin here because of the overwhelming importance of Martin Luther King Jr. in the events of 1968. So we can start here, which will give you enough background to understand King and his role. Recognizing that there were many events involving the struggle for civil rights equality going back much farther in American history. And there had been protests similar to Rosa Parks' protest, even prior to 1955. But for a variety of reasons, Rosa Parks' protest in Montgomery, Alabama, in December of 1955, sparked a movement in the aftermath. Rosa Parks was a 42-year-old seamstress in Montgomery, and that day in December of 1955, the bus had begun to fill up. She was sitting in a seat in the Jim Crow section of the bus, towards the back, but eventually the other seats filled up, a white passenger boarded, and the driver of the bus demanded that Parks give up her seat. And as most of us are familiar with the story, she refused to give up her seat, ultimately was arrested, and the story might have ended there, but for a variety of reasons, among them that Parks was an activist in the community already and part of the local NAACP. But the community rallied around her, and black leaders in the community recognized that the Montgomery transportation system depended on black customers. And so they decided to organize a boycott after Parks' protest until the bus system was desegregated. The boycott was extremely well organized. Blacks in Montgomery were almost 100% united against the buses, and the transportation system ground to a halt before very long. Blacks would carpool together or walk where they needed to go. They encouraged each other, ran errands for one another, had meetings together at churches to organize things, and were very unified in their effort against the bus system. The pastor at the epicenter of this movement was the pastor at a local church, the Dexter Baptist Church. And of course, this was Martin Luther King Jr. It is perhaps a coincidence that King was the pastor at that church in that community, literally in the right place and the right time, to become one of the key organizers of what became the civil rights movement itself. But in the short term, he became one of the key organizers and key spokespeople organizing the Montgomery bus boycott. He was a brilliant speaker, as we all know, very highly educated. He had studied the techniques of Mohandas Gandhi, who preached nonviolence above all else. And he developed his own brand of protest that became the hallmark of the civil rights movement throughout those early years. The key was nonviolence. He wanted to defeat violence with love. He wanted to show whites who were opposed to civil rights and equality that they loved them. Another element of this was King's willingness to go to jail along with the other protesters. This was in keeping with the practice and philosophy of Gandhi as well. The idea was that there were only so many jails and only so many cells that could hold only so many people, and eventually whites would have to deal with the problem at hand if all of the black protesters were willing to go to jail. And so from the beginning, King demonstrates a calm and a fearlessness in the face of the opposition to the civil rights movement, and those would be very evident in 1968, which we'll see. The bus boycott in Montgomery, using these techniques, eventually was successful. In 1956, the Supreme Court overturned the segregated bus system, and by December of that year, whites and blacks were sitting next to each other on those buses without incident. God Almighty has spoken from Washington, D.C., Martin Luther King said. Now again, we really don't have the time or space here in this course to thoroughly review all of the events of the civil rights movement that follow, but understand that after the bus boycott in Montgomery, a series of events over the next handful of years contribute to the swelling of the civil rights movement. And obviously, by the early 1960s, civil rights was perhaps the most important social and cultural issue in the country. It was certainly at the forefront of much of the activity going on in the country. Another of the kind of benchmark episodes in this were the sit-ins, lunch counter sit-ins that began at the Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. And again, these are nonviolent, peaceful protest. Blacks, and in many cases accompanied by whites sympathetic to them or helping them. But blacks would sit at the segregated lunch counters, request to be served, and when they were not served, they would just continue to sit at the lunch counters. And these often resulted in all kinds of negative responses from white onlookers. In many cases, they were sort of publicized, and so huge crowds would gather. There were a number of very ugly episodes and violence directed against them. You see in the picture here what one of the lunch counter protests looked like. But again, eventually those protests are successful, and the lunch counters and the businesses controlling those lunch counters allow them to be desegregated because, frankly, they don't need to have trouble in their stores and at their lunch counters day after day after day. They certainly don't want violence and things being broken and people being dragged out of their establishments and so on. And so over time, the lunch counter sit-ins are successful. Another phase of the civil rights movement were the freedom rides, which were intended to desegregate the Greyhound bus system, the national bus system at that time. And so the so-called freedom riders would board the buses somewhere in the north where the system was desegregated, and they would ride the buses into the south where the system was segregated. The freedom rides as well met with a great deal of resistance. There were some extremely violent and ugly reactions against the freedom riders. And this was going on during the presidency of John F. Kennedy, and the freedom rides were one of the aspects of the civil rights movement that Kennedy had to confront. And again, this was an area where he was very much torn over how to respond to them, because his sympathies were with the freedom riders and with the cause of equality, but in some ways his votes and support that had won him the presidential election in 1960 relied on white Southern voters. And so Kennedy was very conflicted, but ultimately he did put the weight of the presidency behind the Freedom Riders, which helped, which was a cog in ultimately desegregating the Greyhound bus system as well. One of the other, of course, signature events of that era was the March on Washington in August of 1963, perhaps the most famous single episode of the entire civil rights era, and led, of course, by Martin Luther King, who delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial there in August of 1963, one of the most famous speeches of his career. And it's in the aftermath of the March on Washington. You see the huge crowd gathered there, as many as 250,000 people gathered on the Mall in Washington, D.C. At that point, the civil rights movement has captured the attention of the entire country, and there was a great deal of momentum behind the effort for civil rights. It seemed in that moment that the nation was moving towards some kind of civil rights bill and towards some effort at equality. This again was under the presidency of John F. Kennedy. Kennedy began to agitate for a civil rights bill, but of course he was tragically assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. And so many people, including leaders of the civil rights movement, wondered what would come next under the presidency of that big, brassy Texan, Lyndon Johnson. Johnson, as it turned out, was in some ways a more effective leader in terms of civil rights than Kennedy had been. He was able to use the memory of John F. Kennedy to push through many of the actions that Kennedy had struggled to get done. One of his early speeches on civil rights, Lyndon Johnson said, "The ideas and ideals which Kennedy so nobly represented must and will be translated into effective action." And he meant it. Lyndon Johnson pursued civil rights legislation with even greater determination than Kennedy had. He made a number of black appointments, and these were not just token appointments. These were appointments to some of the highest offices in the land, including a cabinet-level official, Robert Weaver, as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and Thurgood Marshall as the first African-American Supreme Court Justice. And Lyndon Johnson also pursued with great vigor what became the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I've talked about Lyndon Johnson a little bit previously. He was a master politician, a very, very experienced Washington insider who knew how to get things done in Congress. Roy Wilkins of the NAACP met with Lyndon Johnson and came away with this comparison between Johnson and Kennedy. He said of Kennedy, for all his talk about the art of the possible, he didn't really know what was possible and what wasn't in Congress. But Johnson knew exactly what was possible, and he knew how to get it. And so he moved for the Civil Rights Act in 1964. The act that was passed included a number of different elements. It strengthened voting rights, specifically for African Americans, but voting rights in general. Banned discrimination in public facilities. Withheld federal funding from segregated schools, and so we finally start to see the Brown decision being enforced. It created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which would protect against segregation in the hiring process and discrimination in the hiring process. And it also included women in this process of equal rights for women in hiring, promotion, and pay. And ironically, this was added to the bill by a white Southerner who thought including women in the Civil Rights Act might just be enough to prevent it from being passed through Congress. But ultimately it did pass, and thus his plan backfired. In our next lecture, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the civil rights events in the mid to late 1960s leading us up to the year 1968.